out on the unforgiving plains of the Texas Panhandle, where the sky is a merciless, endless blue. A woman's shadow was the only proof she still existed. For 5 years, Evangeline Hayes had spoken to no one but the ghost of her husband and the wind that stole the names of the dead. She was a recluse, a forgotten soul in a land that swallows people whole. But one frigid afternoon, as a freak blizzard clawed its way across the territory, her solitude was shattered. Not by a lost traveler or a curious neighbor, but by the silent, imposing figures of 9 Comanche warriors, their faces painted for war, their eyes holding the cold of the coming storm. They didn't ask for a fight. They asked for shelter. The silence of the Llano Estacado was a living thing. It had weight pressing down on the sod roof of Evangeline Hayes's small cabin, seeping through the chinked logs and settling deep in her bones. For 5 years, it had been her only constant companion. It was a silence broken only by the cry of a hawk, the rustle of a jackrabbit in the sagebrush, or the low murmur of her own voice as she tended the 2 simple wooden crosses on the small rise behind her home. Bartholomew Hayes, beloved husband, Samuel Hayes, our dearest son. The wind had already worn the letters faint, just as time had worn the sharpest edges from her grief, leaving behind a dull, permanent ache. Bart had been taken by a rock slide in a foolish quest for silver up in the territories. Little Samuel, only 4 years old, had been taken by a fever a year later, his small body surrendering in the very bed where Evangeline now slept alone. After that, the world had shrunk to the size of her small homestead, a 1-room cabin, a sturdy corral, a well-tended garden, and the vast, indifferent expanse of prairie that stretched to every horizon. She was 42, though she looked older. The sun and the wind had carved fine lines around her eyes and mouth, and her hands, though strong, were calloused and rough from work that was meant for 2 men, not 1 woman. She was lean and sinewy, her movements economical and precise. She could track a deer dress, the carcass plow a field, and handle the heavy Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall with an unnerving familiarity. She had to. There was no one else. The nearest town, Redemption Creek, was a 2-day ride away, and she made the trip only twice a year for salt flour and coffee beans. The townsfolk looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. A woman alone was a vulnerability, an anomaly. They called her the Llano Ghost. She didn't mind. Ghosts were left alone. On this late autumn afternoon, a strange greenish tint was creeping into the bruised purple underside of the clouds, gathering on the northern horizon. The air grew still and heavy, carrying a biting cold that had no business being there in October. Evangeline paused her hand on the handle of the water pump and sniffed the air. She'd seen this before. A blue norther. A sudden violent plunge in temperature, often bringing with it a blizzard that could appear out of nowhere and bury the world in white. Best bring in the extra wood. Bart. She murmured the words, a familiar habit spoken to the empty air. She worked with a practiced urgency, her long skirts hitched up as she stacked firewood against the cabin's inner wall. She checked the security of the door, the latch on the single window shutter, and the feed for her mule Daisy. Every action was a testament to her survival, a ritual honed by years of solitude. As the first flakes of snow began to fall thick and wet, the world outside her window dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. The wind began to howl a low, mournful cry that grew into a vicious shriek, rattling the very foundations of her home. Inside, she lit the kerosene lamp, its warm glow pushing back against the encroaching gloom. She put a pot of venison stew on the cast-iron stove, the rich smell a small comfort against the storm's fury. She had everything she needed. She could wait it out. She was safe. It was nearly dusk when Daisy let out a panicked bray from the attached lean-to. It wasn't the sound of a coyote or a panther. It was a deeper, more guttural fear. Evangeline froze her hand, hovering over the stew ladle. She reached for the Winchester, the cool, familiar weight of it, a comfort. She moved silently to the door, peering through the small peephole she'd drilled into the thick wood. At first she saw nothing but the blinding hypnotic dance of the snow. Then shapes began to resolve out of the chaos. Horses. Not shod horses, but wiry Indian ponies, their heads bowed against the wind. And then she saw the riders. They were tall, broad-shouldered men, wrapped in thick buffalo robes against the blizzard. Snow clung to their long black hair and the feathers that adorned it. Even through the storm, she could see the glint of rifle barrels and the stark patterns of paint on their faces, black and red, the colors of war. They were Comanche. A war party by the look of them caught out in the open. There were 9 of them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was her deepest fear realized. Not the loneliness, not the hardship, but this. The men who ruled this land, whose claim was written in blood and tradition, long before any white man had dared to cross the Red River. They sat on their horses, silent and unmoving, a line of phantoms in the blizzard, their eyes fixed on her cabin, the only point of shelter for 100 miles. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. The cold that had nothing to do with the storm seeped into Evangeline's blood. They knew she was in there. She could stay silent, pretend the cabin was empty. But the lamp was lit, the smoke from the chimney, a clear beacon. They would know she was lying. And a cornered animal was far more dangerous than a calm one. Her mind raced, weighing the impossible choices. Refuse them, and they might burn her out. Let them in, and she would be alone, one woman with 9 warriors in a space no bigger than a horse stall. Her life would be completely in their hands. She looked at the small carved bird Samuel had made, sitting on the mantelpiece. She thought of Bart's steady hands, the way he'd always said, "Courage ain't about not being scared, Evie. It's about being scared and doing what's right, anyway." What was right? The leader, a man of immense stature, with a face like a weathered rock, dismounted. He walked slowly toward her door, his steps sure and heavy in the deepening snow. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stopped 10 feet away and raised a hand, palm open, in the universal sign of peace. It was a gesture at odds with the war paint on his face. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Evangeline rested the Winchester against the wall near the door, where she could reach it in a second. She unlatched the heavy bar, her knuckles white. She pulled the door inward, just a crack, the howling wind trying to rip it from her grasp. The cold hit her face like a slap. The Comanche leader stood there, his dark eyes meeting hers. They were deep and intelligent, holding no immediate malice, only a grim assessment of the storm and her. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, the words in his own tongue. But his meaning was clear. He gestured to the raging blizzard, then to her cabin, and then to his men. It was a request. Shelter. Evangeline's throat was dry. She looked past him at the other 8 warriors, their figures ghost-like in the swirling snow. They were massive, powerful men, the embodiment of the wild, untamed land she called home. To invite them in was to invite the wilderness itself across her threshold. But she also saw the shivering horses, the way the men pulled their robes tighter, the undeniable fact that man, no matter his race or his reputation, was small and fragile in the face of nature's fury. To leave them outside was to condemn them to death. She met the leader's gaze again. In his eyes she saw not a savage but a man responsible for 8 others making a desperate gamble. In that moment, she wasn't the Llano ghost, the grieving widow. She was just a human being looking at another. With a slow, deliberate nod, Evangeline Hayes pulled her door wide open. The 9 men filed into the cabin, bringing the biting cold and the smell of snow-wet leather and horse with them. They filled the small space, their size and presence, shrinking the room until Evangeline felt like a mouse in a giant's den. They moved with a surprising grace, their moccasined feet silent on the wooden floorboards. The leader, whose name she would later learn was Tavako, gave a short, guttural command. His men began to shed their snow-caked buffalo robes, revealing chests and arms of corded muscle adorned with leather beads and the scars of old battles. They stacked their rifles and bows neatly in a corner, an act of trust that did little to calm the frantic beating of Evangeline's heart. She stood by the stove, her hand never straying far from a heavy iron skillet, her eyes darting from face to face. She saw a spectrum of expressions. Tavako remained stoic, his face an unreadable mask of authority. A few of the younger warriors looked around with open curiosity, their eyes taking in the strange artifacts of her world. The ticking clock on the mantel, the stack of worn books, the faded photograph of her and Bart on their wedding day. But one man's gaze was different. He was younger than Tavako, but older than the others, with a lean, wolfish face and eyes that burned with suspicion and undisguised hostility. His name was Pahayoko, and he watched Evangeline not as a host, but as a trap. Every move she made, every breath she took was scrutinized. He was the coiled snake in the corner, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the blizzard that the real danger was not from the group, but from him. Then there was another. He stood near the back, partially obscured. He was not as broad as the others, but tall and leanly built. His face was calmer, his expression more thoughtful. While the others assessed the room for threats or curiosities, he seemed to be assessing her. His gaze was direct, but not aggressive, filled with a quiet intensity. He noticed the way she held her shoulders, the worn patch on her sleeve, where she wiped her hands, the almost imperceptible tremble in her fingers. His name was Nokona. The language barrier was a chasm between them. Tavako pointed to the steaming pot of stew on the stove, and then to his men, a clear question. Evangeline nodded her throat too tight to speak. She ladled the rich venison stew into the 9 tin bowls. She owned some hers, some Bart's from his mining days. Her hands shook as she passed them out. She expected them to devour it like starving animals, but they were surprisingly methodical. They ate in silence, their manners as formal as any she'd seen in a Boston dining hall. When they were finished, they handed the bowls back, each man giving a slight nod of thanks. One of them, in return, offered her a long strip of dried buffalo meat. It was tough and smoky, and she accepted it with a nod of her own, forcing herself to chew and swallow. It was an exchange, a treaty, being silently negotiated in her own kitchen. As the night deepened, the storm outside raged with renewed fury. The men settled down, taking up floor space, wrapping themselves in their robes. They seemed to be able to sleep anywhere, in any position, a testament to a life lived on the move. Tavako sat with his back against the wall facing the door, a silent, sleepless sentinel. Pahayoko, the hostile one, sat near the stacked weapons, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his dark eyes never leaving Evangeline. Evangeline knew she couldn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, by the fading warmth of the stove, the Winchester now laid across her lap. The hours ticked by, measured by the howl of the wind and the creak of the logs. She found her gaze drawn to Noona. He wasn't sleeping. He had taken a piece of tanned deer hide from his pouch and a small stick of charcoal. By the flickering lamplight he was drawing. His focus was absolute, his hand moving with a fluid, confident grace. He wasn't drawing the storm or a horse or a buffalo. He was sketching the interior of the cabin. He drew the stove, the rocking chair, the small carved bird on the mantel. Their eyes met across the dim room. He didn't look away or hide his work. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw not threat, but a deep, searching curiosity. It was unnerving in a way she hadn't expected. It felt more personal than Pahayoko's open hostility. The first night passed without incident. The blizzard, however, did not. Morning came not with light, but with a pearlescent grey gloom. The snow was piled high against the window, and the wind had not subsided. They were trapped, all of them. The second day established a strange routine. Evangeline cooked. They shared their rations. The silence was still thick, but it was no longer as sharp with tension. It had become a shared confinement. The men spoke to each other in low, quiet tones. Evangeline busied herself with mending a torn sack, the simple, repetitive motion of the needle calming her nerves. In the afternoon, a crisis arose. One of the younger warriors, a boy of no more than 18, let out a low groan of pain. He had a deep gash on his forearm, crudely bound with a piece of hide. He'd clearly gotten it in a skirmish before the storm. Now, in the damp cold, it had become infected. The flesh around the wound was swollen red and hot to the touch. A dark line was beginning to snake its way up his arm. Tavako and the others gathered around him, their faces grim. They knew what it meant. Blood poisoning. Out here, it was a death sentence. Pahayoko shot Evangeline a look of pure venom, as if she and her cabin were somehow to blame for the foulness entering the boy's blood. Evangeline hesitated for only a second. She had seen this before. She put down her sewing and walked over to them. Tavako turned his body, blocking her way, a low, warning rumble in his chest. She ignored it. She looked directly into his eyes and pointed at the boy's arm. Then she pointed to her medicine chest, a small wooden box filled with dried herbs, salves, and clean linen bandages. She held up her hands to show they were empty. "Let me," she said the word, a raw croak. Tavako stared at her, his mind warring with itself. To trust this white woman was to go against every instinct. But to do nothing was to watch his warrior die. He looked at the boy's pale, sweating face and then back at Evangeline's determined one. He saw no deceit in her eyes, only a fierce competence. With a short, clipped nod, he stepped aside. Pahayoko moved to intervene, spitting out a harsh word in Comanche, but Tavako silenced him with a single, sharp command. The authority in his voice was absolute. Evangeline knelt. She gently unwrapped the dirty binding, her touch surprisingly soft. The wound was deep and festering. The smell was foul. Without flinching, she went to work. She boiled water on the stove, adding a pungent handful of yarrow and golden seal from her herb collection. She cleaned the wound with the hot infusion, the boy hissing in pain, but held still by 2 of his comrades. Then she made a poultice of crushed echinacea root and smeared it over the infected flesh before binding the arm tightly with clean linen. Throughout the process, she was aware of Noona watching her. He had moved closer, observing her every action, not with the suspicion of the others, but with the focused attention of a student. He watched how she handled her tools, the confidence in her hands, the way she murmured soft, calming words in English to the young warrior, even though he couldn't understand them. When she was finished, she stood up, her back aching. She met Tavako's eyes. "He needs to stay warm and drink plenty of water," she said, gesturing to make her meaning clear. Tavako stared at the clean white bandage on his warrior's arm. He looked at Evangeline, and for the first time a flicker of something other than stoicism crossed his face. It was respect. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. That act changed the atmosphere in the cabin completely. The tension eased, replaced by a cautious, fragile trust. Later that evening, as Evangeline checked the poultice, Noona approached her. He held out his piece of deerskin. He had finished his drawing. It was the mantelpiece, and sitting on it was the small carved bird. He had captured it in perfect detail. He pointed to the bird, then looked at her with a questioning expression. Evangeline felt a lump form in her throat. She picked up the little wooden bird, its surface worn smooth by years of being held. She held it in her palm, and then, without thinking, she walked to the door and pointed out into the blizzard toward the small rise where the crosses stood, now completely buried in snow. She brought her hand to her chest, then held up 4 fingers the age Samuel had been. She looked at Noona, and for the first time in years, she let someone see the raw grief in her eyes. He understood. His face softened with a comprehension that transcended language. He knew what the silence in this cabin was made of. It was made of loss. He looked from her face to the drawing, and then with a hesitant finger, he pointed at her. Then he drew a single, strong line next to the drawing of the cabin. A line that stood tall against the storm. He saw her not just as a woman of sorrow, but as a survivor. In that moment, sharing a silent story of loss and strength, a connection was forged as unexpected and powerful as the blizzard raging outside. The storm held them captive for 2 more days. The world was a white, howling emptiness, but inside the cabin something was thawing. The invisible line between Evangeline and her guests began to blur. The young warrior's fever broke on the 3rd night, his recovery, a testament to Evangeline's skill. The gratitude of the men was palpable. They began to speak to her, not just with gestures, but with single words in their own language, pointing to objects and naming them. Tsar for stove, Kuts for buffalo robe, Pia for mother. One of them said that last word, while looking at her, a gentle smile on his face. Evangeline in turn taught them English words: fire, water, bread. It became a quiet, patient game, a bridge being built word by word over the chasm of their 2 cultures. Only Pahayoko remained aloof. He refused to participate, watching the growing ease between his comrades and this white woman with a curdled expression. He saw it as a weakness, a forgetting of the blood that had been spilled between their peoples for generations. He would often speak to Tavako in low, urgent tones, gesturing angrily, but the leader would cut him off with a quiet finality. Tavako had made his decision. In this place, under this roof, they were bound by the honor of hospitality, given and received. The bond between Evangeline and Noona deepened in the shared silence. He continued to draw his charcoal stick, seeming to be an extension of his thoughts. He drew her hands as she kneaded dough her profile, as she stared into the fire the way her hair came loose from its bun to frame her face. He never tried to hide what he was doing. His art was a form of communication, a way of saying what he had no words for. One afternoon, he showed her a different drawing. It wasn't of the cabin. It was a herd of horses flowing across a plain like a river, their manes and tails wild in the wind. The energy and freedom in the simple charcoal lines were breathtaking. She realized he wasn't just a warrior. He was an artist. He saw the world in lines and shapes and spirit. She found herself wanting to share something of her own world with him. She pulled out her most treasured possession, apart from Samuel's bird, a heavy leather-bound book of poetry Bart had given her. She couldn't read the words to him, but she could show him the patterns they made on the page. She opened it to a poem by Mr. Whitman. She had read so many times the page was soft as cloth. She pointed to the words, then to her heart. He seemed to understand, touching the book with a reverent finger. He then pointed to his drawing of the horses, and then to his own heart. They were showing each other their souls, using the only languages they had. That evening, as she sat patching one of Bart's old shirts, a task she did more for the memory than the need, Noona sat across from her, watching her hands. The lamplight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a sensitivity she hadn't seen before. He had long, elegant fingers, for a man so large hands that could wield a lance or a piece of charcoal with equal skill. He said a word in Comanche, a soft, questioning sound. He pointed to the shirt, then to the empty space beside her. Evangeline paused, the needle still in the cloth. She knew what he was asking. He was asking about the man who was no longer there to wear the shirt. She looked at the faded photograph on the wall, the one of Bart, his arm around her. Both of them squinting in the sun, young and full of foolish, beautiful hope. She nodded slowly. "Husband," she said the word, feeling strange on her tongue after so long. She pointed to the photo. Bartholomew. Noona looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked back at her. He didn't offer pity. His expression was one of profound shared understanding. He too came from a world of loss, of ghosts, of battles fought, and people gone. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently touch the sleeve of the shirt she was mending. It was a gesture of immense intimacy, a recognition of the love and the grief woven into the very fabric of the cloth. Evangeline didn't pull away. She simply held his gaze, and in that moment, the cabin was no longer a prison of the storm, but a sanctuary where two lonely people from different worlds had found a fragile, unspoken connection. On the morning of the 5th day, they awoke to a different sound. Silence. The wind had died. Evangeline pushed open the door, a wave of snow tumbling inside. The world was transformed. It was a pristine, brilliant landscape of white, stretching out under a sky of impossible blue. The blizzard was over. The Comanche began to stir, a sense of purpose returning to them. It was time to leave. They gathered their weapons and robes, their movements efficient and swift. A strange sadness settled in Evangeline's chest. The silence she had once craved now seemed like it would be a crushing, empty weight. Tavako approached her. He stood before her, his great height casting a shadow over her. He held out his hand not to shake, but palm up. In it lay a single perfect eagle feather, its base wrapped in red-dyed leather. It was a gift of the highest honor, a symbol of courage, strength, and wisdom. He spoke a sentence in his language, his voice deep and solemn. While she didn't understand the words, she understood the meaning. It was a thank you. It was a mark of respect. He was acknowledging her as an equal, a person of strength. She accepted the feather, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. "Thank you," she whispered. The men filed out, retrieving their horses from the deep snowdrifts around the lean-to. They were warriors again, preparing to meld back into the wild. Noona was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, turning back to face her. The bright morning light framed him, making him seem like a figure from a dream. He held out the piece of deerskin with his drawings. He rolled it up carefully and pressed it into her hands. It was a gift. All his observations, all his unspoken words were there in the charcoal lines. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense, and for a moment Evangeline was sure he was going to say something. Instead, he simply raised his hand and gently, hesitantly, touched his fingers to the side of her face, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. The touch was light as a feather, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body, waking something that had been dormant for 5 long years. Then he was gone, mounting his pony and following the others as they rode away, 9 dark figures against the blinding white snow, not looking back. Evangeline stood in the doorway, the cold air on her face, the eagle feather in one hand and the deerskin roll in the other. She was alone again. But the silence that settled back over the cabin was different. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of memory, of a shared storm, of a connection she never would have thought possible. She unrolled the deerskin. On the back there was one final drawing he must have done in the pre-dawn light. It was a portrait of her. But he hadn't drawn the sorrow in her eyes. He had drawn the strength. For a week, Evangeline lived in the strange aftermath of the storm and her guests. The cabin felt cavernous and empty. The silence rang in her ears. She would find herself making too much coffee, her hands moving through the motions of providing for 10 people instead of 1. She kept the eagle feather on the mantel next to Samuel's bird. At night, she would unroll Noona's deerskin drawings and study them by lamplight, tracing the lines with her finger, remembering the quiet intensity in his eyes. She was different. The hard shell she had built around her heart had been cracked. A little light had gotten in. She found herself humming as she worked a thing she hadn't done in years. The world still felt dangerous, but it no longer felt entirely empty. The snow melted under the relentless Texas sun, turning the prairie into a muddy brown sea. It was this thaw that brought the second more malevolent storm to her door. His name was Augustus Cain. Cain was a cattle baron who had moved into the territory 3 years prior with a vast herd and army of hard-faced cowboys and a belief that the world belonged to any man with the ruthlessness to take it. He owned most of the land east of Redemption Creek, but his sprawling ranch lacked one crucial element, a reliable, year-round water source. His cattle were fouling their own creeks, and the deep aquifers were starting to run dry. Evangeline's homestead, however, was blessed. The well Bart had dug was deep, tapping into a sweet, inexhaustible spring. Furthermore, a small creek fed by that same underground source ran through the western edge of her property. In the dry season, it was the only running water for 30 miles. Augustus Cain wanted that water. He had approached her twice before. The first time he'd sent one of his foremen with a low-ball offer to buy her out. She had refused. The second time, he had come himself, a large, florid man with pale, cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. He'd doubled his offer, and added a veiled threat about how dangerous it was for a woman to live alone. She'd met his threat with the silent, unwavering barrel of her Winchester. He had left his face a mask of fury. Now he saw his opportunity. The blizzard would have weakened her, strained her resources. He imagined her desperate, half-starved, and ready to break. He was a predator who smelled blood in the water. She saw them coming from a long way off, a pillar of dust rising against the afternoon sky. It wasn't the light, scattered dust of a few riders. It was the heavy, churning cloud of a dozen or more. Her brief sense of peace evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. She secured Daisy in the lean-to, barred the window shutter, and took up her position by the door, the Winchester resting in the familiar crook of her arm. Augustus Cain rode at the head of the pack, flanked by his foreman, a wiry, mean-eyed man named Floyd, and 10 other hired guns. They were not dressed for ranch work. They were dressed for intimidation, their gun belts slung low, their faces hard and emotionless. They reined in their horses a few dozen yards from the cabin, forming a semicircle, a classic tactic of intimidation. Evangeline Hayes Cain's voice boomed across the prairie, oily and arrogant. "We've come to have a final discussion about your property." Evangeline pulled the door open and stepped outside, blinking in the harsh sunlight. She didn't raise the rifle, but held it loosely at her side, a clear message that she was armed and ready. "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Cain," she called back, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her stomach. "This land is not for sale." Cain chuckled, a humorless, grating sound. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation. I'm not asking any more. This is a final notice. You will accept my offer of $500, and you will be gone by sunrise tomorrow. I have the deed of sale right here, just needs your signature." He patted a leather satchel on his saddle. "It's a fraudulent document, and you know it. This land was deeded to my husband by the state. It's mine, now." The state Cain sneered, gesturing around at the vast emptiness. "The state is a long way from here, Mrs. Hayes. Out here, the only law that matters is the law of strength, and as you can see, I have a great deal more of it than you do." His men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their pistols. The threat hung thick and heavy in the air. "This is my home," Evangeline said, her voice dropping, filled with a cold fury. "The only thing you'll get from me is a bullet if you set foot on it without my permission." Cain's face flushed with anger. His patience, thin to begin with, was gone. "You foolish woman. Did you really think you could stand against me, Floyd? You and a few of the boys, go in there and start packing her things. We'll escort her to town personally." Floyd and 2 other men dismounted, smirking as they started toward the cabin. Evangeline's heart pounded. She could take 1, maybe 2 before they cut her down. It was a hopeless, desperate stand. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder, the stock pressing firmly against her cheek. She sighted down the barrel, her finger tightening on the trigger. And then a new sound. It was the soft thud of unshod hooves on damp earth. From behind the small rise where her husband and son were buried, 9 figures appeared. They crested the hill and paused their ponies, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. They were not painted for war now. Their faces were bare, their demeanor calm. But their presence was more shocking than any war paint. Tavako sat at their head, his face like granite. To his right was Noona, his eyes immediately finding Evangeline, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. To his left was Pahayoko, and on his face was a look of savage glee. He had been denied a fight with an enemy he was forced to trust. Now here was an enemy he understood perfectly. Augustus Cain and his men froze. Their smirks vanished, replaced by gaping disbelief and a sudden prickling fear. They had expected a lone woman. They were now facing 9 Comanche warriors who had appeared as if summoned from the earth itself. Tavako urged his pony forward, the others following until they formed a second line, a silent, deadly barrier between Cain's men and Evangeline's cabin. They didn't draw their rifles or bows. They didn't have to. Their presence was weapon enough. Cain stared, his mind struggling to process the impossible. What is the meaning of this? Who are these savages? Tavako looked not at Cain, but at Evangeline. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. We are with you. Evangeline lowered her rifle slightly. Her body flooded with a relief so profound her knees felt weak. She was not alone. Nokona's eyes were locked on Cain, and they held a cold fire she had never seen before. He saw the greed, the arrogance, the threat to the woman who had shown them kindness, who had healed his friend, who had shared her grief with him. It was Pahayoko who broke the silence. He spat on the ground in Cain's direction and spoke a single guttural word in his own language. It was a curse, and its meaning needed no translation. Cain, finally finding his voice, sputtered with rage and confusion. I have no quarrel with you people. This is a business transaction with this woman. Get out of the way. Tavako ignored him completely. He spoke in Comanche, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of absolute command. Nokona and 2 other warriors dismounted, moving to stand on either side of Evangeline. They carried their rifles, now holding them with a casual readiness that was far more menacing than any open threat. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Cain and his 12 hired guns were no longer the intimidating force. They were intruders facing a united front on land that did not belong to them. His men were cowboys and bullies, not seasoned fighters used to facing Comanche. Fear began to ripple through their ranks. They exchanged nerveless glances, their bravado gone. Cain, his face purple with fury, and humiliation made his final fatal error. He was a man who could not stand to be seen as weak. To hell with this, he roared, drawing his pistol. This is my land. Fire on them. He aimed not at the warriors, but at Evangeline. It was the last decision he ever made. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and motion. Before Cain could even fully level his pistol, before his command had even registered with his terrified men, an arrow materialized in the air. It flew with a sound like ripping canvas impossibly fast and struck Cain's gun hand. The heavy Colt revolver clattered to the ground as he screamed a high, thin sound of shock and agony. The arrow, fletched with a hawk's feather, had gone straight through his wrist, pinning his hand to the horn of his saddle. Every warrior moved at once, a symphony of deadly efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. They were not 12 separate men fighting. They were one organism honed by a lifetime of combat. Pahayoko let out a raw, triumphant war cry as he knocked another arrow. Tavako's rifle was already at his shoulder. Nokona, standing beside Evangeline, pushed her back toward the cabin door with one arm, while bringing his own Winchester up with the other. Inside, he yelled the English word sharp and urgent. Cain's men were thrown into chaos. They had come for an easy intimidation, not a pitched battle with the Comanche. A few of them, including the foreman Floyd, managed to draw their weapons and fire wildly. Their shots kicked up dust near the ponies or whined harmlessly over the warriors' heads. Their panic was met with lethal precision. A rifle cracked from Tavako's position, and one of Cain's men slumped from his saddle, a neat hole appearing in his chest. Another warrior, firing from the back of his moving pony, put a bullet through Floyd's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling into the mud. Evangeline, stumbling back against the cabin wall, watched in a state of horrified awe. This was not the clumsy, drunken brawling of saloon fights. This was a brutal, swift, and terrifying art form. The Comanche moved with their horses as if they were one creature, firing, reloading, and shifting position with a fluidity that Cain's static, terrified men couldn't comprehend. Pahayoko was a whirlwind of joyous violence. He loosed 3 arrows in as many seconds, each one finding a target. One struck a cowboy in the thigh, another pierced the neck of a horse, sending the animal screaming to the ground and trapping its rider beneath it. He was not just fighting, he was reveling in it. Evangeline, her back pressed against the rough logs of her home, raised her own rifle. Her shock was receding, replaced by a cold, clear focus. This was her land. These were her protectors. She would not stand by as a spectator. She sighted on a man who was trying to take aim at Noona from behind a panicked horse. She breathed out, squeezed the trigger, and the man's hat flew from his head as he yelped and dove for cover. Noona glanced at her, a flash of surprise and fierce approval in his eyes, before turning his attention back to the fight. He wasn't a whirlwind like Pahayoko. He was methodical. He fired, took a man down with a shot to the leg, and used the moment the others were distracted to move to a better position. He was protecting Evangeline, but he was also controlling the battlefield. The entire confrontation lasted less than a minute. It was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Faced with a force of nature, they had foolishly provoked the remaining conscious and unwounded members of Cain's posse broke. They wheeled their horses around and fled, galloping madly back toward the east, their flight a desperate, shameful rout. Silence descended once more, thick with the smell of gunpowder and the groans of the wounded. 4 of Cain's men lay on the ground, 2 dead, 2 writhing in pain. The man Evangeline had shot at was scrambling away on foot. Floyd was clutching his shattered shoulder, his face pale with shock. And Augustus Cain sat on his horse, whimpering, his hand pinned to his saddle, a look of utter broken defeat on his face. Tavako rode his pony slowly forward until he was face to face with the cattle baron. He looked at the arrow, then at Cain's terrified, tear-streaked face. He reached out and with one powerful wrench snapped the shaft of the arrow, leaving the barbed head buried in the wood and Cain's flesh. Cain shrieked in agony. Tavako spoke, his voice low and cold as a winter river. He spoke in English, the words slow and deliberate, learned perhaps from traders or captives, and saved for moments of grave importance. "This land," he said, gesturing with his rifle to the cabin. "The well, the graves on the hill, is under the protection of the Numunu, the people. The woman who lives here is Pia Tuhbi Pue, a friend of honor. You will not return. You will tell your people what happened here. If you or any man like you comes to this place again, we will not leave you alive to carry the message." He then looked at the wounded men on the ground. He gave a sharp command in Comanche. 2 of his warriors dismounted, collected the rifles from the fallen men, and unceremoniously dumped the wounded onto their horses. They rounded up the other horses, including Cain's. "You will walk back," Tavako said to Cain, "and you will remember." With that, he turned his back on the broken man. The war party gathered the spoils of their victory rifles and horses and herded the wounded men's mounts before them. Cain slid pitifully from his saddle, clutching his bleeding wrist, and began to stumble away in the direction his men had fled, a humiliated, ruined figure. The Comanche turned their attention back to the cabin. The fight was over. The violence was done. They looked at Evangeline, who stood with her rifle still in her hand, her knuckles white. Noona walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling from the adrenaline of the fight. His eyes searched her face for any sign of fear or injury. "You are not hurt?" he asked, his English as careful and deliberate as Tavako's. "No," she breathed, the word barely a whisper. "I am not hurt, thanks to you." He nodded, his gaze softening. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then back at her face. "You fight," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of respect. "I had to," she replied. Pahayoko rode up a bloody scalp hanging from his belt, taken from one of the dead men. A triumphant, savage grin was plastered on his face. He looked at Evangeline, and for the first time his expression held no hostility. He let out a sharp cry, raised his lance in the air in a salute to her, and then wheeled his horse around, letting out a whoop of victory. In the crucible of combat, she had proven herself. She was not a weak white woman. She was a fighter who stood her ground. In his eyes, she had earned her place on this land. Tavako gave a final nod to Evangeline. The debt of hospitality had been repaid in blood and protection. His duty was done. He gave a quiet order, and the warriors began to move out, driving their newly acquired horses before them. They were leaving. For good this time. They rode away, not as they had before, into a world of white, but into the warm, golden light of the setting sun. Their dark shapes moved across the prairie, growing smaller and smaller, until they were just specks on the vast horizon, melting back into the land that had birthed them. Noona was the last in the line. Just before they disappeared over a gentle rise, he stopped. He turned in his saddle, a lone silhouette against the fiery sky, and looked back. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but she felt his gaze across the distance. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, solemn gesture of farewell. Then he turned and was gone. Evangeline stood there until the last trace of them had vanished, until the dust had settled, and the only sounds were the mournful cry of the wind and the soft groans of the two men Tavako had left behind. Dead men. A grim testament to the day's events. A profound exhaustion settled over her, so heavy it was a physical weight. She looked at her home, at the ground churned up by the horses, at the dark stains in the dust. The sanctity of her solitude had been violated twice, first by a blizzard, then by violence. But she was still standing. Her home was still hers. She did not flinch from the task ahead. With a grim resolve, she took a shovel and began to dig. She would not leave the bodies for the coyotes. Whatever their sins, they were men, and they deserved a final resting place. She worked through the twilight and into the dark, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel the only sound. It was hard, grueling work, but as she labored, she felt a strange sense of cleansing. She was burying the last remnants of the threat, reclaiming her land with her own sweat and toil. When she was finished, she stood between the two new unmarked graves and the two familiar crosses on the rise. 5 years ago, she had buried her hope here. Today, she had buried her fear. She returned to the cabin, the eagle feather and Noona's deerskin drawings sitting on her small table. They felt like artifacts from another life. She was no longer just Evangeline Hayes, the widow. She was the woman who had sheltered a Comanche war party, the woman who had faced down Augustus Cain, the woman who had stood and fought alongside them. The name the Comanche had given her echoed in her mind, Pia tu bi pue, a friend of honor. Days turned into weeks. The story of what happened at the Hayes homestead spread like wildfire. Cain's broken, humiliated men had told the tale, and it grew with each telling, becoming a local legend. Augustus Cain, his hand permanently maimed and his reputation shattered, sold off his holdings and disappeared from the territory. No one ever bothered Evangeline again. The story of the Llano ghost was replaced by the story of the Comanche woman, a figure of respect and fear. Travelers gave her homestead a wide berth, not out of suspicion, but out of a deep-seated awe. Evangeline's life returned to a routine, but it was a new kind of solitude. It was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of the past weeks. She found herself looking to the horizon, not with dread, but with a strange, persistent flicker of hope. She would often touch the eagle feather, or unroll the deerskin, her fingers tracing the drawing of her own face, the one where he had seen her strength. One evening, months later, as spring was breathing new life into the prairie, she saw a rider approaching. She reached for her Winchester out of habit, but her heart didn't pound with fear. There was something familiar in the way the rider sat his pony, a natural grace that was unmistakable. It was Noona. He rode alone. He was not painted for war or dressed for travel. He wore simple buckskins. He stopped his pony a respectful distance from the cabin and dismounted. Evangeline walked out to meet him, her steps sure, her heart beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. He carried no drawings this time. He simply stood before her, the setting sun catching the deep, dark calm in his eyes. He had learned more English. Perhaps he had traded for the knowledge, sought it out with the same intensity he applied to his art. Evangeline Hayes, he said, her name sounding natural in his deep voice. Noona, she replied, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I came back, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I see that, she said, her voice soft. He looked at her cabin, at the land around them, and then his eyes settled back on her. This is a lonely place for one person. It has been, she admitted, but it is my home. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. A home needs more than one voice, he said. So the silence does not win. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small object. It was a bird carved from the pale wood of a cottonwood root. It was exquisitely detailed, its wings slightly spread as if about to take flight. It was a mate for the one Samuel had carved. He held it out to her. Evangeline looked at the bird in his hand, then into his eyes. She saw no grand declaration, no impossible promises of a future she couldn't imagine. She saw only a quiet offering, a beginning, a voice to add to her own against the silence. She reached out and took the bird, her fingers closing around his for a brief moment. His hand was warm and strong. In that touch, a new story began. Not of a white woman or a Comanche warrior, but of two survivors. Two souls who had found an unlikely sanctuary in the heart of the unforgiving wild. The future was an unwritten page, but for the first time in a very long time, Evangeline Hayes was not afraid to read it. In the Untamed West stories weren't just written in books, they were carved into the land by hardship honor, and the surprising bonds forged in the face of impossible odds. Evangeline and Nokona's story reminds us that beneath the divisions of culture and the scars of conflict, a shared humanity can endure. It teaches us that strength isn't about the absence of fear or loneliness, but about facing them with an open heart. That true shelter isn't just four walls and a roof, but the courage to see the person behind the stranger's eyes. What do you think was the biggest turning point in their story? The blizzard, the healing, or the final battle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this tale of the Old West captured your imagination, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas and forgotten legends from the American frontier. Thank you for listening.